Good morning, everyone. Welcome to the annual Barry K lecture at Wilfrid Laurier University, analyzing the recent 2021 federal election. My name is Simon Kiss, and I'm a political scientist at Wilfrid Laurier University's Digital Media and Journalism program, and the director of the Laurier Institute for the Study of Public Opinion and Policy. So we organized this panel in cooperation with the Department of Political Science to bring together three distinguished guests to both honor the lifetime work of Barry K and to live up to our mandate to disseminate knowledge, but facilitate discussion about the intersection of politics, policy, and public opinion. Joining us today are three distinguished panelists: Dr. Darrell Bricker, the CEO of Ipsos Global Public Affairs; Abigail Binman, Global National's Ottawa correspondent; and Dr. Andrea Perrella, professor in the Department of Political Science. So before we begin, I just want to say and emphasize Barry K was a founding member of LISPOP and a longtime member of the Laurier community as a member of the Department of Political Science. And his work studying and understanding the intricacies of Canadian elections and American elections, particularly at the regional and sub-regional level, was widely followed throughout Canada, and he contributed immeasurably to Canadians' capacity to understand their own political processes. We're particularly grateful to be joined today by Barry's wife, Betty Leventhal. First, we're going to hear from Darrell Bricker of Ipsos, then from Dr. Perrella, and then we'll close with Abigail Binman. Following the panel's presentation, we'll have some time for questions and answers. To give the panelists the best experience possible, we've muted all the participants. When it comes time for the Q&A, we'll take questions either verbally, you can signal by raising your Zoom hand, or we'll unmute you, or we'll take questions via the chat function. Thanks for everybody for joining us, and we'll turn it over to Darrell, then Dr. Perrella, and then Abigail.
Okay, thanks, Simon. I'm going to hope that this works. No, I don't see it. Anyway, okay, so what I'll just do is I'll just go through my talking points.
There we go. You see it, Darrell?
We can see it? Good. Okay, look at that. By chance. Before I get into this, I just wanted to say a couple of words about Barry. I am one of those rare people that actually was a student of Barry's, but also had the opportunity to work with him at Global Television on elections since 2016. Now, I took my introductory statistics course from Barry 40 years ago. So that's how long I knew Barry K. And that he passed me was, I don't know why he bothered, but he did. And he certainly inspired me to look at what it is that I'm doing now. I wouldn't have started without Barry, and without also Steve Brown, who I took the other part of the course from. Barry was an incredibly kind, generous, wonderful spirit to work with all the time. He was, as I said before, I took undergraduate courses with him, but he was also one of my graduate supervisors when I did my MA at Laurier. So I was very proud to say that. But I also wanted to say that since this was the first election since 2006 that we didn't have Barry on the set at Global, and I'm sure Abigail would echo this. In fact, they paid a tribute to him during the course of the broadcast. So he's very sorely missed, but very fondly remembered. And I just want to say what an honor it is to be at Laurier today to participate in this session, and to commend LISPOP for starting this session, because I think that Barry more than deserves it. So that being said, I'd like to switch over to my take on the 2021 election. There will be many other takes, but this will be my take. So I just want to set the stage for what happened during the election campaign. First of all, basically to understand the Canadian electorate, there's two groups. There's progressives, there's conservatives. Progressives have the advantage. About 60% of the population. Conservatives are at a disadvantage. The demographic change that's happened in Canada over the space of the last 30 years has shifted the electoral geography now. It used to be the Laurentian elite way of winning elections and campaigns, which election campaigns was you win in Quebec, you obsess over the national question, and anything else that you pick up, particularly in Ontario, is how you win. It's putting those two things together that made elections win. Liberals did it mostly, but Conservatives back in 84 and 88 also managed to pull it off, the old Progressive Conservative Party. But that's the old geography of elections. Western Canada has grown so much more in importance since then that it's no longer an afterthought. It's now a place where you can actually build a national coalition from. Particularly for Conservatives, it's where they need to do well in order to win a national election campaign. But what's also changed, not only the importance of the West because of the growth of the Western population, it's really now become about the suburbs. 90% of the population growth in Canada over the space of the last 20 years has been in car commuting suburbs. We have a representation by population system. The more people that you have, the more power that you have through seats in the House of Commons. So it's now all about winning the suburbs. The Liberal strategy, and has been this way for some time, has really been to demonize the Progressive, or to demonize the Conservative Party in order to marginalize the NDP. So as the Conservatives have a grouping or a potential coalition of about 40%, Progressives about 60%, they vote for two different parties. Some of them vote for the Liberal Party, some of them vote for the NDP. You can also add the Greens into that group. The strategy for the Liberal Party has a high ceiling and a low floor. So if the Liberals aren't able to unite the Progressive vote, their vote really drops off quite precipitously. The Conservative strategy is quite opposite. I wrote a book about this with John Ibbotson called The Big Shift, and it really is the Conservative strategy, the modern Conservative strategy. It really requires the splitting, a combination of the splitting of a Progressive vote, winning in Western Canada, but most importantly, winning the suburbs of the major cities in our country, particularly in the 905 in the Greater Toronto area. If they can't do that, they can't win. It's how Stephen Harper won in 2011, how he won his majority, but he also won in 2006 and 2008. Very different from the way that Brian Mulroney won in 1984 and in 1988. Very different election outcomes. This strategy has a low ceiling. In other words, you can only possibly get up to 40%, and that's very optimistic, but it has a high floor. They have a core vote of 30% anytime that they go to the polls. The Liberals don't have a core vote that high. The NDP, their strategy, they need to figure out whether they're Ed or Jack. Ed Broadbent was always happy if he could be the balance of power in a minority government. Jack Layton didn't see his role that way. He saw his role as destroying the Liberal Party and becoming the standard bearer for progressives in the country. He had a much bigger ambition than Ed Broadbent ever had. They need to sort that out. They were very confused on that point, I think, through the course of this election campaign. The rest, the BQ, the Greens, and the People's Party, very easy to understand. The BQ is just a spoiler in the province of Quebec. The Green Party, all they were trying to do in this election campaign was to get noticed, and most importantly, to get on the national stage for the national debate. And the People's Party, they also wanted to get noticed. It would have been nice to get on the national stage for the debate for them, but they just wanted to at least do better than the 1% they got in the last campaign. This was the best situation that the Liberal Party has had to win a majority since 2016. They never were as strong in the polls as they were just prior to going into this election campaign. The election result, at its face, nothing changed. The Conservatives won the popular vote, but the Liberals won the plurality of seats and won the election. The seat totals, the parliamentary positions, nearly identical, and turnout, interestingly enough, in which everybody thought it was going to be really low this time, was the same as it was in the 2011 election campaign when Stephen Harper won his majority. It was around 61. This was a low volatility campaign. I know there's other people saying that, there was all these whipsawing and numbers all over the place. We never saw it. All the shifts were small and steady, and there was a lot of sound and fury signifying very little in terms of moving votes. Why did the Liberal Party win? They optimized vote efficiency. They won the downtowns where they have to win, and they carried the suburbs, which is why they won. They also did a little bit better in Western cities and picked up a couple of seats, but it wasn't really material to the outcome of the election campaign. What was material was how well they did in the suburbs of Vancouver when you look at Western Canada. Why did the Conservatives lose? They didn't deliver on the big shift. They did well enough in Western Canada, but they did not do well enough in Ontario. They didn't create the bandwagon for change that they needed. When we got down to the end of the election campaign, What they really needed was a convincing argument as to why they were going to win, and they didn't have it, which didn't bring their coalition together in order to beat Trudeau. People till the very end of the campaign thought that the Liberals were going to win. So O'Toole was not able to create that bandwagon. Singh, the NDP was neither Ed nor Jack. They couldn't figure out who they wanted to be. They didn't cause the vote split that the Conservatives Party needed in order to win the election campaign. The BQ merely held on. The Greens were decimated, and the People's Party became the none of the above party. One of the things that people don't know about the Green Party, but my colleagues at Wilfrid Laurier know about the Green Party because they wrote a paper about this based on the exit poll that we did a few years ago. The Green Party, half of the people who voted Green didn't even have the environment as their number one issue. They tended to be the none of the above party. And what's happened in this election campaign is they were replaced by the People's Party as the none of the above party. So where to from here? This is where I see things going in terms of political support going through the next couple of years. A win is a win is what the Liberals are saying, but this is a win with a big loss. Trudeau leadership has now gone through its full cycle. They moved from darling in 2015 to disappointment in 2019 to now significant segments of the Canadian population dislike Justin Trudeau. What's next? I've never seen anybody really come back outside of a national emergency from dislike. It's possible, but he's got a much harder situation to deal with now than he's ever had in his political career. For Aaron O'Toole, can he reconcile the fundamental differences in the Conservative Party in order to be able to win a national election campaign next time around? Do they even want to win? And this is always a problem with the Conservatives. Sometimes they actually just enjoy it. The Reform Party never had a chance of winning. They enjoy being opposed to the Laurentian elite and the Laurentian consensus. Do they even really want to win a national government? A question they need to answer. And what needs to change in order to make the big shift work? And I'm going to just put this on the table and I'll wait for the questions and answers. It's not becoming red Tories. People who claim red Tories or progressive conservatives don't really understand what that term means. It's not somebody who's progressive on social issues and conservative on economic issues. It's somebody who back in the 1980s and before that was prepared to take on the liberal way of winning governments and try to win according to that strategy. What the Conservatives really need to do is become suburban conservatives. They have to win there. It's not about being progressive, it's about being suburban. Yes, they cross in many elements, but there are some aspects to that that are unique. It is a misunderstanding of the term red Tory. I learned that from Rod Preece at Wilfrid Laurier, the dearly departed Rod as well. NDP, is Jagmeet Ed, Jack, or is he just Andrea Horwath? He's just going to continue banging along until maybe he gets a chance to win. That's a decision that the NDP has to make. It was clear under Ed, it was clear under Jack, it's not clear under Jagmeet Singh. The BQ will just keep on BQing, as defined though by the CAC. It's no longer the national project, it's more of a nativist project. It's about defending Quebec culture. It's about defending the future of Quebec within Canada, as opposed to separating from the country. This is the agenda that's defined by CAC, not defined by the PQ. The People's Party, are they a one election wonder or the real deal? Very hard to say at this stage of the game. As I said, they've become the none of the above party. There's a place for that on the Canadian political spectrum. And finally, the Green Party, are they even relevant anymore? Great branding, but in terms of the issues agenda that the Green Party has, it's really been subsumed by both the Liberals and the NDP. So even coming out on the environment, even though they have that brand position, because they can't win, they can't affect the environmental position of the government as much as the Liberals and the NDP can right now. So who are they going to be going through into the future? That's the agenda, I think, for the next couple of years. Those are the questions that are on the table. And I'm happy to turn it back to you, Simon.
Okay, Darrell. Thanks for that really great presentation. I've got some questions here I'd like to ask when we get to that. Next, I'm going to turn to Dr. Andrea Perrella to talk about the role of Indigenous issues in the 2021 campaign. Andre.
Thank you, Simon, and thank you, Darrell. And I also, I think I echo the sentiment, the widespread sentiment. We really appreciate your kind words that you said about Barry Kay. We miss him dearly. It's been about 2 years, and I still can't believe. But anyway, he's been an influence to me as well, and I hope we do him proud in carrying the tradition of our analysis of politics. My talk is about Indigenous issues, and a little over a year ago, a colleague of mine, who's I believe present today, Andrew Basso, who's also an associate of LISPOP, approached me to do a study on public opinion in Canada related to Indigenous issues. And we spent about a year developing a questionnaire, and we administered it, or we plan to administer it in the summer of this year. And then Kamloops happened. And as everybody knows, there was a rediscovery of unmarked graves of children at the Kamloops Residential School. And as you can see here, there was a fair bit of public outcry. A lot of people were placing shoes at the steps of residential schools, at the steps of churches, in order to express a sadness and anger that children died on these grounds, but died almost anonymously, almost like as if they did not count. And that was 215 back in Kamloops. And then other discoveries or other rediscoveries were made, and the number grew to thousands. Our concern was, well, this is certainly going to impact our survey. When we ask people questions about what they think about the various Indigenous issues, the widespread media coverage of all these unmarked graves, it may bias our answers. It may inflate our answers. As you can see, the number grew to more than 6,000 and counting. There are going to be more announcements of unmarked graves at various locations across the country. So this is an issue that continues to evolve. So naturally, I thought, well, Indigenous issues will certainly be an important election issue in 2021. But then we started to receive data from our survey before even the campaign. And as was indicated in some press release that we released around our survey, one measure remained relatively unchanged from around 5 years ago. Around 72% of respondents in our survey agree with the Truth and Reconciliation Commission that the residential school system was cultural genocide. Relatively unchanged from a similar survey that was done around 2015, shortly after the TRC report. So in one sense, we can say not much has changed. But again, I was wondering if the 72% that we measured is itself a little bit inflated in light of the context of the coverage of these unmarked graves. So we wondered, to what extent is Indigenous matters an election issue? Well, let's look back a little bit of what were some of the top election issues. And for this, I'm going to rely on some of your data, Darrell, that you've donated to Laurier over the years. So the top election issue in 2011 was the economy. Not surprised, the economy is always one of the top issues. The same in 2015, the economy was the top issue. In 2019, it was healthcare. And I have to say, healthcare, the economy, these are two very, very salient election issues. And healthcare again in 2021. Healthcare, but not too distant from that, is COVID, which was a separate issue that was measured by the Ipsos Election Day survey. Now, when we go back and compare, all right, given the respondents that were collected in these surveys, and there were lots, tens of thousands of people in each of these Election Day surveys, what percentage indicated Indigenous issues as one of their top concerns when it came to deciding their ballot? Back in 2011, hardly made a percent, not even a percentage point, not even 0.5%. 2015, barely a change. In 2019, it became a little bit more apparent because then the TRC released its report, so there was more talk and more activity around reconciliation. And in this election, in September, 8% of individuals in the survey indicated that Indigenous issues was an important election day issue. I'll have to point out that they weren't asked to pick their number one issue. They were asked to pick 3 issues that were important to them. And 8% selected Indigenous issues as one of their top 3 issues. So it didn't even make that high of a list. So that is one observation that we're making about the where do Indigenous issues stand. Again, this is in the context of all these announcements and images that we're seeing of unmarked graves and little shoes put on the footsteps of residential schools and on churches and city halls and other public places. In terms of the overall percentage of individuals who've indicated various issues, again, healthcare ranked pretty high in the survey. 36% of individuals indicated healthcare as one of the top issues. 34% indicated the COVID-19 pandemic. Again, I'm not surprised by healthcare being top in any election. I am not surprised that COVID was indicated as a top issue in this election. For climate change, that's a little bit of a surprise. It's not usually a top election issue, but it was one in the last election. We've been talking more and more about climate change. There's been more visible signs of natural disasters, of the icing, the melting of ice in the Arctic, vicious storms. So there's been a little bit more coverage of these natural disasters in the context of climate change. The economy, again, I'm not surprised the economy is up there. And affordable cost and affordability and cost of living was another widely spoken about issue in this campaign. And then we get Indigenous issues, which was selected by 8% of all respondents in the survey. So who are these 8%? Well, I did a little bit of looking around. Most are likely to have voted NDP. I'm not particularly surprised. They're more likely to be female. They're less likely to reside in places like Quebec, Alberta, or BC. I'm a little bit surprised about BC. They tend to have lower income. They're not Catholic. They're not evangelical Protestants in terms of their religious affiliations. And they're more likely to obtain information from social media. So a lot of their media consumption, not that they relied heavily on social media, but those who relied more on social media were more likely to be interested or more likely to have been guided by Indigenous issues in terms of how they voted. Now, there was another survey taken by Abacus that looked at various issues to see which age demographic was more likely to select a particular issue as a top concern. And as you can see somewhere here, towards the bottom half, reconciliation with Indigenous peoples was not ranked very high among older millennials. And it is among the top 5 issues in younger millennials. So even where the issue is important, it is not a top 3, it is not a top 2, it is barely a top 5. All right, so again, in the context of all that we've been seeing in the news, and we keep seeing updates in the news about more graves being discovered and more talk about reconciliation, the issue still hasn't quite elevated to the same level as healthcare, climate, and the economy. Across parties, we see that the respondents who've indicated, who selected Indigenous issues as a top vote issue were, again, 60% of them, 16% have indicated that they voted for the NDP, 10% voted Liberal, or I should say, sorry, among NDPers, 16% indicated that Indigenous issues was a key issue. Among Liberal voters, 10% indicated that Indigenous issues was a key issue. And you can see the rest of the percentages here. And in Quebec, not much different, although here 5% of Bloc voters selected Indigenous issues as a concern, as one of their election issues. Across Canada, you can see that when we divide the sample by their province of residence, not very high. We sometimes see double digits, such as Manitoba and Nova Scotia. But overall, respondents across the country are fairly equal in that very few of them have indicated Indigenous matters as a top election issue. Now, I thought maybe this was to do with the media. Maybe the media didn't give enough attention. And so I had the LISPOP research assistantship staff look into this. And certainly, in terms of what issues were covered by the media during the course of the campaign, certainly the pandemic, as you can see here, was dominant. I'm not surprised. And then at the bottom here, it's like a bit like a Tour de France, where there's a leader and then there's a pack right behind it. And in this crowded field are all the other issues. And top, almost consistently top in this crowded field is the economy. And a little bit below that is Indigenous issues, which weaves a little bit with climate. So what you see here is that given the remainder of the issues, the 5 other issues, Indigenous matters rank maybe in the top 2, top 3 in this crowded field, but it competes with these others. So it doesn't stick out as a dominant issue. It competes with all the other ones. Now, in terms of, okay, what impact did it really have on the vote? I ran some models and I calculated some probabilities in terms of if someone indicated that if someone selected Indigenous issues as a key factor in their vote decision, how would that have changed their vote for a particular party? And I broke it down by region because, as you know, in Canada, regional matters is extremely important. And as you can see quite evidently here, that the NDP is more likely to gain votes and the Conservatives are more likely to lose votes. I'm not surprised by the splitting directions of these two parties. What I'm a little bit surprised about, and I may explain a few things, is the relatively thin bars for the Liberal Party. The Liberal Party may not have gained much, voters among those who have indicated Indigenous issues as a top election concern. They may not have lost much either. So it was a bit of a flat issue. And the same is true even for the People's Party. The purple bar here is relatively thin. Curiously, in Quebec, the Bloc Québécois seemed to gain a few extra points among those who've selected Indigenous issues, and that may have to do with maybe some overlap with progressive views and social justice. I'm not sure. But this is one graph that is not surprising in terms of the NDP and the Conservative, but I'm a little bit surprised that the Liberals have not had any traction on this. In terms of how it compares to other issues, among those who've indicated COVID-19 as a top election concern, they were more likely to have leaned to the People's Party. In a sense, their interpretation of COVID-19 was their opposition to lockdowns and their opposition to health protocols and vaccine mandates, I imagine. So the COVID-19 issue was not contextualized in terms of what position does a respondent take. And another issue is the economy. And you can see here again, there's not much surprise. The Conservatives have gained among voters for whom the economy is a top issue. The Liberals have lost, the NDP have lost. And you can see even on the side here, a table that indicates which party do people think is best able to handle a various issue. And you can see the Conservatives seem to own the economy issue. And if I go back a little bit, the NDP seems to own the Indigenous issue, and the Liberal Party seems to own the COVID-19 issue. Now, other issues that were common among respondents, so those who've selected Indigenous issues, what were other issues that came up? Again, they were asked to pick 3. So climate change came up, COVID-19 came up, healthcare came up. Among those who selected COVID-19, again, healthcare came up, climate change, the economy. And among those who selected the economy, COVID came up, healthcare, and government finances. So there are some overlaps here in terms of concern. A lot of voters share similar concerns, but when it comes to Indigenous issues, that seems to have a little bit of a separate category. Apart from the fact that it wasn't selected by many people, once it was selected, those people do not necessarily share the same concerns as other voters. So what can I conclude from all this? Well, Indigenous matters were not a major election issue. And that's probably why we haven't heard much of it. I mean, we've seen Jagmeet Singh and the NDP do something about that, but as you can see, they've done it in order to as an act of justice, or they've done it in order because they realize a lot of their members are interested in this issue. But it wasn't a major election issue, and it's not for lack of trying. In my many media interviews during the campaign, often a journalist would ask me if I had anything else to add. Sometimes I would say, yeah, I'm wondering why we're not talking more about Indigenous issues. And that was pretty much the end of it. Even the press release that we released in the summer related to our survey didn't get a whole lot of media traction. So maybe there's not a whole lot of interest out there among the media. And there were attempts even by Andrew Basso and I to write op-eds based on our research. And again, the newspapers weren't all that interested in our op-eds. So there is something to question about why is this issue not being discussed? And for those for whom Indigenous issues is important, are they more likely to vote NDP and less likely to vote Conservative? Is that really what we found here? Is that the big conclusion? Number three, and for those who have indicated Indigenous issues as important, they also seem to be interested in climate change. There is a bit of an overlap in terms of reconciliation with the Indigenous issues and reconciliation with the earth. So there may be some epistemological overlap there that is worthy of some exploration. And also those who've indicated other issues are important are less likely or not likely to consider Indigenous matters. Again, they occupy different electoral mind spaces. And all this takes place, again, within a context of increased attention on residential schools and their increasingly enumerated unmarked graves. In terms of where to go from here, I do have some questions for consideration. Well, what does it take is what I like to know is what does it take for a significant proportion of the electorate to be interested and moved by Indigenous issues? Clearly they were moved when they saw those images. That's why those staircases in churches and residential schools and other public places are full of children's shoes and toys. They were moved, but what does it take to move them electorally? That I have not been able to answer. Would the relevance of Indigenous issues matter as a vote issue if all party leaders gave it more attention? And this is something that I've been thinking about and discussing with my collaborator in terms of maybe we need leadership on this. We can't just expect the public to drive this issue. It may need to be driven by the leaders. And would it help if this issue was tied to other issues that are already seen as important? Again, we've seen some overlap between or among Indigenous issues and climate change. So maybe there is a case to be made in terms of some linkage, and perhaps that would generate some interest as well. So that's all I have for you. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Andre, for that presentation. Again, there's a lot to chew on there. I've got some questions here for you. But before we get there, I'd like to turn to Abigail Binman for her impression and reflections on the campaign. And I'll just say, we're shifting gears here a little bit from two experts in public opinion to an expert in the actual kind of mechanics of campaigns. And I'm excited to kind of find out from a close-up look how the leaders and the campaigns experienced campaign 2021. So, Abigail.
Hi, I'm very pleased to be here. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Abigail Beeman. I'm joining you from, well, it's a little gloomy today, but we have this lovely view of Parliament Hill. I'm in Ottawa. I've been a reporter with Global National for 4 years, and most recently I was on the road for the entire election campaign, out traveling with the Liberals, the Conservatives, and the NDP. Before I was at Global, as some of you may know, I spent 7 years in KW. I worked for CTV Kitchener, so that's one of many reasons reasons why I'm very pleased to be part of this panel today, and also to echo the words of some of my panelists. I'm just so very honored to be part of a lecture that's in Barry Kay's name, and I just so benefited from Dr. Kay's brilliant insights and commentary for years, both when I was in Kitchener working locally and with municipal and provincial politics, and then at Global News. And I just wanted to say that I thought of him so very often during this campaign, and his contributions were very much missed, both along the trail and, as Darrell mentioned, especially on election night this year. So as Simon mentioned, I was asked to focus on how the parties responded as things unfolded in real time on the road, and give you a bit of an inside look at the campaigns. And I'm going to do that just sort of speaking chronologically based on who I was with as things unfolded, how I saw it, how the party saw it. And I also want to speak a bit about what it was like to be on the ground for some of those vitriolic protests that we saw. And if I have some time, also just touch a bit on what covering a campaign during a pandemic was like, because that was certainly something that was new for all of us. And I also hope to have some time at the end to take your questions. So keep in mind, those of you who are joining us, I'm happy to answer anything about life on the road, life on the campaign, anything behind the scenes that you may not know. So just to run through some of the basics for those of you who may not be familiar with the mechanics of a campaign, in terms of the Conservatives and the Liberals, they have two campaign buses. So you have a leader bus and a media bus, which are exactly what those things sound like. The leader and his, in this case, his staff are on one bus, and the media as well as some campaign staff are on the other bus. And the NDP, Conservatives and Liberals all have one plane. So when you're on the plane, the leader sits at the very front, and and there's some staff and reporters are generally close to the back. So not a ton of access overall to the leaders. The exception here would be with the NDP, and the NDP use one bus only. So you have basically as much access to Jagmeet Singh as you'd like. He's not always on the bus. Sometimes he rides in a separate RCMP vehicle in certain situations, but in general, the leader is on the bus with the media all at the same time. So a little bit of a different dynamic there. And a lot of the questions that I was getting in terms of this presentation today was, how do campaigns respond when something goes well or when something goes not so well? What are you looking for? In general, if things on a campaign are going well, no matter what the party is, spirits are generally higher. You're just experiencing sort of a different tone, a different feeling. It's sometimes difficult to put into words, but important to remember, of course, that on the media bus, your campaign staffers, they know that if something's gone wrong and they're having a bad day, and they let you know that they're having a bad day, they know that all of us journalists are going to talk about that, and that the number one question we get when people are asking what it's like on the road is always, what's the mood? How's the mood like? How's the campaign responding? What's the mood? So the staff who are on the road with you are making a very big effort to, keep it under control if something's gone off the rails, and not let you see that things are, so bad. So in generally speaking, what I watch for are those tiny human interactions that might be a bit different. So who's a staff person that's maybe a little shorter with you than they normally are? Or is there a staff person who's taking a smoke that you've, never seen taking a smoke break before? So it's sort of those interesting human moments, those, tiny human indicators. But in general, and I guess I didn't mention this off the top when I talked about the buses and the planes, these are really long days. So you're doing multiple provinces in one day, very common for days to be between 14 and 18 hours with lots of stops. Everybody's in a, small confined space. So, people being tired or short with each other happens anyway, but you really have to have that lens on to think of, what's going on the campaign, and what does this mean for what's going on with the party or how they're responding. So when I started on this campaign, I was with the Conservatives for week one, and you may remember that was a pretty good week for the Conservatives. They came out with a tiny lead. Things were going well for them. And what I wanted to highlight of note for me during week one on the campaign with the Conservatives was that we actually saw Aaron O'Toole try to push the issue of mandatory vaccinations as a wedge issue. So at that point, or very earliest days of the campaign, he was trying to point out that the Conservative position on mandatory vaccination was vaccinate or rapid test, and he was trying to say that was similar to a government department memo that was online. The Liberals countered that, saying that wasn't true. That memo ended up getting taken down. But I found it interesting to flag that it was really the Conservatives in the early days who were pushing vaccines as a wedge issue that could not have gone worse for them in the end, the way that things turned around on the mandatory vaccine page, because it really became clear, and still seems to be clear to this day, that the majority of Canadians support mandatory vaccinations. And then also was interesting that you had a Conservative candidate who only had one shot campaigning in a seniors' home in Peterborough, and the Liberals really successfully used that case as to their advantage to push this idea that O'Toole would not demand that his candidates declare their vaccination status or be double vaccinated. And you see that that's still an issue that's playing out right now as we figure out how the House of Commons returns, virtual or in person, and what does that mean if you're not vaccinated. I also like to point out that example of that Peterborough candidate being not fully vaccinated campaigning in a seniors home, because she ended up winning in that riding. And, not only was it a Conservative win with that issue, but that's a bellwether riding for the most part for decades and decades and decades. And she was able to unseat a Liberal cabinet minister. So it didn't seem to play out, on the ground or locally as such an important issue, but nationally, you heard the Liberals using that at most campaign stops, talking about this behavior of a candidate who was campaigning on not fully vaccinated in a seniors home. I from where I sat on the campaign, to me, it really felt like there were two halves or two different feelings of this campaign going on based on what we tied to what we were seeing in the polls. And in the beginning, the Liberals were taking several hits as the Conservatives maintained that small lead. There was vaccination that I spoke a bit about. There was also the issue of what was going on in Afghanistan, which seemed to overshadow things. And Trudeau faced a lot of criticism about a slow government response to getting people out of Afghanistan. And every time Justin Trudeau had to answer a question about Afghanistan, that's a minute that he can't be talking about the Liberal platform or plans for the next government, which is just generally speaking unhelpful from a political point of view. So the second week of the campaign, I moved for the Conservatives to the Liberals, and things aren't really going as well. It would be a gross exaggeration to say that there was a depressive mood. When I talk about the mood, there certainly wasn't a depressive mood, but there was a different tone, and you could just sort of, feel in the air that people were less thrilled, I think would be fair to say, with the Conservatives having this small lead. But towards the end of week 2 and into week 3, the midpoint of the campaign, that's where I felt things shift from where I was on the inside. And the Liberals were sort of very slowly starting to turn things around and claw forward, but it really took some time. And there are some Liberal insiders who believe that a really key moment here was this rally in Bolton. I'm not sure if some of you remember what happened, but this was a rally north of Toronto that had to be canceled due to the security threat of the protesters. I was there, I was on the ground. The protesters were varied, and I'll come back at the end and speak a bit more about these protests and the impact in general. But the catch-all here, I would say, if you had to put a blanket on them, is that they were all anti-vaccine mandates. So sure, a lot of anti-vaxxers, but not all anti-vaxxers. There's this anti-vaccine mandate, and overall just anti-Trudeau. People who were furious. But I've really never seen anything like this before. Just people so angry, shouting obscenities nonstop, like for hours. Middle fingers in the air, people with babies on their hip in one hand and middle finger in the air in the other. It was really a level of anger that I had not seen before. Later on, as the protests continued, we started seeing more purple in the crowd, more People's Party of Canada supporters who were coming out to this protest. But I want to note that that wasn't the case in Bolton. At this Bolton rally, there was no sort of clear political organization or anything to this group of angry people. So they decide to cancel this rally for security concerns. Trudeau moves to a second location in a park, and he took a very empathetic tone when he's talking about these protesters. He references that everyone has had a really hard year with the pandemic. That tone didn't last long. I think it was a few days later, we saw him become more frustrated as these protests continued, and it didn't seem that anything was able to stop them or stop this anger. But that night in Bolton, it really seemed to shore up support for Trudeau. People seemed to like the way he was responding, empathetically. And it was really the exact opposite of what all these super angry anti-Trudeau protesters were hoping for. But for the Liberals, those protesters seem to hammer home why some of these liberal policies around vaccinations may be necessary, because these super angry protesters were scaring people. So that was a key moment there as things shifted. The third week of the campaign, I was with the NDP. This was a key week in terms of it being the first debate. So this was the French debate on TVA. And this had a very important moment for the Liberals. This was when Trudeau came up with this quip about page 90. Page 90 had to do with the Conservative platform on gun control, and page 90 was literally the page where they discussed gun control. And originally in this platform, the Conservatives talked about repealing the weapons ban that the Liberals had put in place in 2020. And when they were attacked, when the Conservatives were attacked, they did something extremely unusual and changed their platform mid-campaign. They added some language to their platform to say that those guns would remain, that under a Conservative government, those guns would remain banned during a review. So this gave the Liberals an opening to hammer home this idea that Erin O'Toole is not trustworthy, you know, saying one thing to get elected and messaging something else to the gun lobby, and it went back and forth from there. And what I find interesting about what happened and why that worked for the Liberals, and why you heard it at basically every single campaign stop day after day, is regardless of whether you're a voter who cares about guns or pays attention to the real minutia of gun control and orders in council and what's an assault weapon or an assault style weapon, you may not care or know about, you know, the ins and outs or the specifics, but the Liberals were able to hammer home this idea that O'Toole was not trustworthy, and that's what they were trying to stick when they landed this message. And that, coupled with the Conservative position on slashing the popular $10 a day childcare plan and vaccinations, the Liberals used all of those pieces to sort of slowly but surely, step by step, come back in the polls and on the ground. I know that a lot of people are curious about how the Conservatives were responding as they were being hammered on guns and on these other issues, and as they started to slip. Sadly, I can only be in one place at one time, and I was with the Liberals for the whole final stretch of the campaign. So I obviously, you know, heard from my colleagues, and not rocket science to suggest that the Conservatives were less than pleased by all of this, and things became less jovial on the campaign. But I only had eyes on the Liberals for that final home stretch, and for them, for the Liberals in those last 2 weeks, I would describe it, the mood, as cautiously optimistic. So nobody's, you know, popping champagne, but that mood sort of slowly lifted and changed, especially on the final day of campaigning, which was a 26-hour marathon day where the campaign beat the clock, as the term is, sort of fighting against time zones. So that morning, or the last day of campaign morning, we woke up in Montreal, we did some events in Ontario, then we flew to Winnipeg, and then we flew on to Vancouver for a midnight PST event, and then red-eyed it back to Montreal on election day. So a real marathon day, but you could tell the Prime Minister himself and his staff were all in really better moods. You could feel it on that final day. Still cautious, but there was that feel in the air that perhaps they knew what was coming. So that's sort of my look at how things unrolled on the campaign trail. I want to go back to those protests for a moment. I've covered a lot of political protests at all levels of government, and I've just really never seen anything like that, just in terms of the sheer anger. When there was that escalation to violence, and you may remember that sort of became an infamous moment on the campaign when somebody threw this gravel. It happened in London, and we spent a lot of time as journalists debating whether gravel or small rocks or whatever was what was the most precise description of what was going on, but it was somebody's driveway, and somebody was picking up sort of handfuls of this stuff and hurled it at the Prime Minister. There was some of my colleagues got hit, some of the RCMP officers. There was all this gravel in the air. Nobody was actually hurt. It was just more confusion. But when this happened, there was this real feeling among us that we were so close to violence. So you have these big crowds of the angriest people that I've ever seen in sometimes in small spaces, managed a variety of different ways in terms of security, depending where you were. And for me, and I know some of my colleagues as well who talked about this, it really felt like it was a bit of a tinderbox, that it wasn't going to take much for an escalation. And really, thankfully, that gravel incident was the worst of it. I remember coming off the campaign that week and really just bracing and trying to prepare myself for what was coming next, because it really felt like this could be the beginning of something worse. And thankfully, it calmed down after that. The anger certainly did not calm down. It was still very much present. You had these very anti-Trudeau people who were coming from a variety of backgrounds to a variety of settings, and just there was that pure sort of fury, and being in those crowds was a very strange feeling. But that violent element did dial down. And I've mentioned a couple of times, crowds and small spaces, and I did want to just end on a note about COVID during the election, because I do get a lot of questions about what that was like. So everyone traveling with all of the campaigns had to take a daily COVID test. The exception was the NDP. They instituted that later on. I was there, so I think that was week 3 in the middle of the campaign. They brought on the daily test. Before that, the NDP just required a temperature check to board the airplane when they took the airplane. And though the specific requirements of showing proof of vaccination, this was an issue was discussed a lot. So it was slightly different between the campaigns, but basically everybody had to be fully vaccinated to cover these campaigns, especially for traveling to a number of provinces that require you to show proof of vaccination without having to, or otherwise you have to isolate, which is like obviously impossible when you're flying to Halifax for a 2-hour event and then flying back out again. So you did need to be double vaccinated. In the case of the Conservatives, that party actually took your proof. So I had to submit my proof of vaccination before I got on the road with them. In the other parties, I was, submitting to the provinces directly, but overall you had to be vaccinated to cover this campaign. And it really was more on the Liberal campaign than the others that you felt at times that the pandemic had been forgotten. Like there were just multiple events that just felt too tight. I think the one that the Liberals were criticized for most heavily happened in Brampton, where they had 400 people inside in a ballroom. The Liberals maintained, as they did at every event that was super packed, that they were following the rules. It certainly felt very tight. And in these crowds in that crowd in Brampton were 2 politicians who were very senior in every sense of the word, and that's former Prime Minister Jean Chrétien and a 100-year-old former Mississauga Mayor Hazel McCallion were there. And I want to tie that to also tell you that as journalists, you're given very little information when covering the campaign. That was compounded by the protests. They stopped publishing specific addresses and locations of where, I'm just speaking for the Liberals now, or speaking about the Liberals now, where Justin Trudeau was going. They stopped publishing that. So you would get your schedule for the next day. Sometimes like it would be regular that it would be as late as, let's say, 10 o'clock at night. You don't necessarily know where you're going. That does sometimes became more complicated with COVID. So for example, at that rally in Brampton, we showed up, we weren't even told this is an indoor event versus an outdoor event. Maybe you want to grab another mask, whatever. So you sort of there's a bit of this element of surprise that we showed up to, 400 people inside this ballroom, and you're indoors. So definitely, strange living the COVID affected lives that we all have been, and then going on this campaign where in some cases it felt like COVID wasn't there anymore, but again, double vaccinated, and we did take those daily tests. So I think that I will wrap it up there. And like I said, very happy to take questions on anything I spoke about or anything that you come up with that you're curious about in terms of political life on the road.
Thank you, Abigail. That was tremendous. We're going to open things up to questions from the room. I want to kind of pose one, though, to start discussions, and then I'll turn it over to participants. We can take questions via the chat, or if people want to ask questions verbally, they can signal with their Zoom hand, and I can unmute you. And in terms of time, so I wasn't entirely sure how long this was going to go. I think we'll see how things go. We've got at least 5 minutes till the 1 hour mark, and we can, I think, see how long people stick around and declare a kind of a hard end at 1 o'clock. So my question is actually to Darrell, which is before the campaign and a bit in the campaign, you did see Erin O'Toole make some very interesting noises about making pitches to workers. So one of his platform planks was increasing worker representation in federally regulated industries. And he talked about how unions had, needed to be given a bit more standing. So my question to Darrell is, do you know, or what's your impression, is that pitch targeted to this big shift? Is that pitch was that an attempt by O'Toole to target those suburban voters that are so important to elections?
100%. And they learned this from watching Boris Johnson's campaign in the UK. But, quite frankly, this is a global phenomenon in which you're seeing progressive voters increasingly clustered in the downtowns and people who are more open to conservative messaging living outside of the downtowns of major cities. And if you look at the people he was speaking to, they're basically private sector workers and people who are commuters. So that's who he was trying to appeal to, and it's absolutely on strategy.
Okay. And Andre, there's a couple of questions about in the chat about the importance of ignorance and why it's so difficult to pay attention or get settler Canadians to attend to Indigenous issues. And it's super interesting to see how you get, media attention that just dwarfs and generates so much interesting issue and attention on an issue, and yet people kind of drift and have their own opinions. And so it's a kind of a reminder, isn't it, about how public opinion is its own beast, and you get media coverage and news coverage about issues, and a lot of times people kind of move to the beat of their own drummer.
Well, this is one issue that is not overly intrusive. Very few people realize that they may be living on unceded land. And I remember I was talking to my partner in this study yesterday about Montreal when I attended. I was a young journalist attending an event at Concordia University in downtown Montreal, and right after the Oka crisis, and the panel was opened by the chief of the Ganawagi, which is a Mohawk reserve just on the other side of the river from downtown Montreal. And he started with a prayer, and then he said, "I want to welcome you to Mohawk territory." That Montreal, or this university, is still on Mohawk territory. And that was the first time I realized, oh, really? I did not know that. And I lived in Waterloo since 2007. It's fairly recently that I heard about the Haldimand Tract. I think the problem is that it is not real in terms of it's not apparent. We don't know about indigeneity in Canada because it is not something that we come in contact every day. We may be walking and living on and exploiting unceded land, but there's no sign that says this is the land of, and then it'll tell you the Indigenous community. None of that. So we're only now beginning to learn a little bit about this through land acknowledgements and whatnot. But I think this is an issue that is not intrusive, meaning it's not something that people interact with daily. They interact daily with the economy, with healthcare, with COVID, you name it. But Indigenous issues, it might as well be an issue in a foreign country. That's how much contact we have with it. And I think that's the reason I asked if this is an issue that is best guided by leadership. And sometimes that's what's needed in public opinion, as you would know, is that issues sometimes don't emerge from the public, they emerge from leaders talking about it. And the fact that our leaders are not really talking about it, I think is also a reason why the public is not overly conscious about it.
Mm-hmm. I'm going to draw on Evan's question in the chat here and just expand on a little bit. So Evan asks to Abigail how the Liberals reacted. Were they happy, sad about the result? And I just want to go further because since this election result, we had this Tofino Gate, this just total disaster of a decision by the Prime Minister to tour to Tofino on the day of the National Truth and Reconciliation. And so I want to sort of take Evan's question about how the Liberal kind of caucus and staff, kind of senior tier of the leadership of the party, reacted and asked basically whether Trudeau's job is in jeopardy going forward here, because I could see caucus members inside the Liberal caucus being extremely frustrated with the decision to call an election and subsequent judgments.
Yeah, there's a lot there. I think certainly there was some frustration, and we asked that question about, is Trudeau's job in jeopardy, all the way along the campaign. And of course, you know, he basically laughed it off, and nor should he have, you know, answered that while trying to fight for his job in this election. I just want to make sure I get to all pieces of this answer. On election night, I would say there was not like a uniform response to how Liberals were feeling. There were some Liberals that felt a majority was possible. I think most were seeing how tight this was the whole time, and therefore what happened really felt like a win for them. So there was maybe muted happiness as this unfolded, but it really was, you know, so tight. And watching those early results come in, I compared it that night to 2015 when the Liberals swept Atlantic Canada, and it was clear from that moment, like, okay, we're in this situation where Liberal majority is very much in play. And then you saw those early results come in and it still wasn't clear. So I heard a lot from, you know, Liberal insiders that night of like, well, just wait and see. We're not even sure about this seat, or that seat's too close to call. So there wasn't sort of an overwhelming feeling one way or another. Certainly frustration about Tofino. Certainly that's there seems to be no legitimate explanation for how somebody thought this was a good idea, and frustration as well. I have not personally heard anybody question whether he should be in the job as directly linked to Tofino. The question, you know, hangs in the air in terms of this decision to call an election and how that unfolded, not with the majority that they wanted, but certainly one that will, I'm sure, you know, come back as this government moves forward.
Okay, questions are coming in hot and heavy here. I'm going to go try to get through them. So there's a question, I think a good one, about the issue facing Raj Saini. So the former MP who was, I guess, removed as a candidate, although he was still in the ballot. And the question is whether this had any impact on the issue along the national campaign trail. And I'll just say, you know, in such a tight race with a minority parliament on the line, I can see how this would be like doubly important, where actual, you know, losing one MP or one particular seat could mean the difference between remaining in government or losing government, or which party might have a balance of power. So Abigail, did you notice this get any pickup at the national level?
Yeah, it certainly did. I think, and we talk about frustration, and there certainly was frustration that the center waited so long to make this decision, to the point that there could be no Liberal candidate, you know, in that riding, and they, like you said, in this tight situation, have effectively gone and lost themselves a seat. So there certainly, you know, was frustration about that, about how it was handled, why it wasn't, you know, didn't seem to be dealt with faster, and like with every other situation with these types of allegations, there's very little comments coming out, or very little information coming out as to what's happening on the ground. We certainly saw the opposition parties hammer on Trudeau's handling of it. I was there when in the room when he announced that Mr. Saini would not be the candidate for the Liberals going forward, and that was the big topic of the day, and all of the national reporters filed on it, I believe, that day. I did also, you know, I saw that question come up, and it also it struck a memory in my mind of, I think it was the very next day after Mr. Saini, they announced that he wouldn't be the candidate, or a day after that, and we were in Toronto in a really tight race, Julie Dershowitz's Davenport riding, which she narrowly held on to, and she opened her comments. It was just, it had nothing to do with Mr. Saini. Obviously, Trudeau was coming to pay a visit to the riding, and she opened her comments by talking about how proud she was to have a feminist prime minister, and a prime minister who really stood up for women. And I remember standing there thinking, like, okay, either this is totally out of touch to what everybody is talking about, to speak to your point about it becoming, you know, a national issue, or this is a very pointed comment about how she stands by him. And I didn't have the opportunity to ask her, and I do think it was the former, that it just, was out of touch to the situation as it was unfolding. But let me say that it had enough of an impact that a comment like that really stood out as jarring, because that was, top of mind for everybody as we were watching that situation unfold.
Chris has a question on the PPC for Darrell, and I'm going to take that question. So the question is, did Aaron O'Toole move too far to the left? Was there vote splitting? Did the PPC cost the Conservatives the election? And I just want to expand on this just a little, Darrell, and move it forward a little bit and ask, and maybe Abigail after Darrell could add to this, the decision to start the campaign wedging with a wedge issue on vaccine passports, was that less of a mistake and more of a strategic move by the Conservatives to try to staunch losing voters to the People's Party? Like, were they reading the rise of the People's Party early on, trying to prevent a further drift? So I'll go to Darrell first on the PPC, and then if Abigail has anything to add about that specifics, you can add.
Okay, so on vaccines, I think, they may have been trying to wedge it, but I think that they were dealing with an unfortunate situation. You may not have been, all conservatives weren't anti-vax, but most anti-vaxxers were conservatives. And that's the problem that he was dealing with, not just in terms of his candidates, but also in terms of his own caucus, as Abigail's seeing now, and we're all seeing in Ottawa, but also in terms of his voters. So he was dealing with a problem that he had to try to find a bridge to. I don't know there was so much something that he wanted to deal with, and they really saw it as an advantage to go after the Liberals. It may have come across that way, but I really think he was, if you would have asked him his druthers, he probably would have been preferred to have a position that was better aligned with what the majority of the Canadian public wanted. I think he was making a virtue out of a necessity. As far as the PPC goes, and whether or not O'Toole went too far left, I didn't think he went too far left. He didn't go far enough suburban, I think, which was a problem. But the other problem that he had is the issue that you really need to be for a Conservative to win in the suburbs is a strong lead on the economy, which O'Toole developed through the course of the campaign. He had a 10-point lead over the Liberals, but people weren't voting on economic issues this time around, as you saw from Andrea's presentation before. So instead, what ended up happening was that they developed what I would describe as a fatal flexibility. They seem to be willing to negotiate on every single aspect of their platform. And when you have a huge platform on that, you give people a lot of strings to pull, and they had a lot of strings that got pulled by their opponents during the course of that campaign. And O'Toole didn't really seem to be prepared to come down firmly on anything. And he had this kind of fatal flexibility, which didn't so much confuse his voters, but made him appear less likely that he was ready to form the government and able to win. And what really did O'Toole in at the end was his inability to convince all of the people who would consider voting for him that he was going to win. Right up to the very end, most people believed that the Liberals were going to win this campaign. So what that allowed people, for example, like the People's Party, and you'll see this in the exit polling that we gave you, Andrea, that overwhelmingly the second choice for People's Party voters was the Conservative Party. Overwhelmingly, they preferred Aaron O'Toole over any other leader running in the campaign, including their own. But they didn't believe that he was actually going to win the campaign, which left them able to see voting for the People's Party as a no consequence type of vote. I could register my protest, none of the above, that type of thing, mainly because they didn't think that casting their vote for the Conservative Party was actually going to lead to the defeat of the Liberal Party. So that's what was going on at the end of the campaign. It wasn't that people were buying into all the protest stuff. I know it made great, there was a lot of action about all of that. It didn't really have that much of an impact on the campaign. There wasn't a lot of specific action according to any policy that was going on. It just kind of cast this kind of an atmosphere around the Conservatives like they weren't going to win, that they seemed confused. They didn't really seem to be ready to govern, which meant that people really didn't feel that they were the vehicle to defeat the Liberals. And if they aren't able to do that, then you're going to see the type of splitting that I described on On the progressive side, you're going to see it happen on the conservative side, and that's what occurred, especially in the last 3 or 4 days of the election campaign.
The only thing I'll add on that, just in terms of the question of mandatory vaccination, is just a point of color from that first week of the campaign when I was with the Conservatives and they were making an issue out of this. I had a story that night, or one of the, I think it might have been the second night of the campaign, with a line in it almost identical to what Darrell said about how Aaron O'Toole has to be careful because there are some of his supporters. Like I don't think I could have been more vague in how I said it, but I said something like some of his supporters are anti-vax or are not fully vaccinated. And I got a sort of a testy text from a Conservative campaign staffer that night wanting to know where I got that information from. And I just found that so fascinating in terms of evidence of just like how on guard they were, how closely they were watching that file, what an impact it had, how important it was. I could have told you the sky is blue, that there are some Conservatives who are not comfortable with mandatory vaccinations. So I wrote this person back and I listed, I spoke to this number of people and this is where this came from and this is where this came from, and they literally just did not respond to me. But that stuck in my mind. When someone takes issue with your coverage, there's usually a reason behind it. And it told me that from like the very beginning of this, they were very conscientious about mandatory vaccination and vaccination in general and how it was going to work or not work for them.
Okay, very interesting. Question from Matthew for Darrell. Could you elaborate a bit more on the difference between progressive Conservatives, red Tories, and the suburban Conservatives?
Okay, so for example, the perception is that what this progressive Conservative or a red Tory historically was somebody who had this, I'm very progressive on social issues, but I'm really a conservative on economic issues. No, they weren't. They were also progressive on economic issues. There really was no ideological difference between a liberal of the 1980s and a conservative of the 1980s, or even taking it back over time for a very long period of time. What changed was when the West became more important to the electoral calculus, in which a conservative in contemporary Canada actually has to be able to make that conservative case in Western Canada. So being a progressive in Western Canada and trying to present yourself as that type of conservative is a really difficult equation to balance in Western Canada. So the thing about what Stephen Harper was able to pull off was he was able to push off the national unity question, Quebec, which has been the dominating issue for Canadian politics since 1867, push it into the background. And he was able to also elevate economic, I would say, private sector kind of orientation in government, smaller government, lower taxes, all that kind of thing, caring about the deficit, that type of perspective on being a conservative, which actually is popular in the 905, is popular in the suburbs. He was actually able to put that together in order to win the election campaign. This time around, even if Aaron O'Toole did that, people weren't talking about that. And we know that he won on that. You can see it in Andrea's data from the exit polling, but it's really clear and all the stuff that we were doing that the Conservatives built a pretty substantial lead on economic management. But what needs to happen for an issue to work in an election campaign? It has to be something in which you clearly define a difference between your major opponent, and it has to be important. And the problem in this election campaign is even though there was a clear difference, it wasn't as important as a lot of other things that were being considered by the Canadian electorate at that during the course of the election campaign, which was why he could not break through in the 905. Even though, by the way, Aaron O'Toole was able to reduce the Liberal lead in the province of Ontario compared to Andrew Scheer by 50%. It went from about 9 or 10 down to 4. And he was so close, so close. If he lost, I think the number was 42 or 45 ridings by less than 5 points, most of them in the 905 in the Greater Vancouver area. 1 point nationally, 1 point more, he probably would have won those ridings. It was that close.
So building on that, there's a question then from Larry Diani in Hamilton about whether O'Toole can or is going to survive as leader, or whether the Tories are going to do what they often do, which is eat their own.
Well, as George Perlin wrote in the 1960s about the Tory syndrome, Andres, you're old enough to remember this stuff. They have a way of going after themselves, the same way that the Liberals did in between, after Jean Chrétien lost and they went through their interregnum as they sorted through leaders. I actually don't think that the Tories are going to do anything with O'Toole, and there's a couple of reasons for that. One of them is that he did get through this campaign, and there are some points of difference in performance that I think he can point to. And I think when cooler heads prevail, they'll sit down and look at some of the progress that they've made, and the smarter people in the party will realize that there's something that's working here for them. They have potential. The second thing, he's already been vetted. We found out that he wasn't, a secret American. We found out that he wasn't on all the problems that Andrew Scheer had. So he's been through all of this. He's been through the worst of what you can be through. There's really no surprises to emerge around Aaron O'Toole. So that there's a bit of an advantage to that. The next thing is he is a very flexible, malleable individual. He's prepared to build coalitions and put things together and probably do the kinds of deals within his caucus in order to be able to keep it together. By the way, the caucus is really the only mechanism for getting him out right now. And the next thing, we're in a minority situation. We could end up in an election any day. And it is a party that's flirting with disaster that decides to get rid of its leader when you're in this kind of a situation. So I think he survives.
Just going to pause there. You raised the minority parliament. I'm just going to canvass our three panelists for a question, just to offer a short-term, kind of a short to medium-term prediction of how this parliament is going to carry on. I'm going to assume that there isn't going to be an election, but how do you see the near term in the next few years in this parliament?
I'll jump in to say that I think next few years would be shocking if this minority government lasted that long. I know there was a lot of suspicion on the road that if this was a minority government response result, that we could be looking at going back to the polls in another 12 months or so, as depressing as that may be for some people. But I don't think it will last a few years. I think that's the only prediction I'm comfortable making at this point.
Darrell, any predictions?
Yeah, it's interesting. I'm kind of with Abigail because she's got really good insights on what's going on there. But I'm also a student of history. And I remember Stephen Harper between 2008 2011, for love or money, could not find a way to get defeated or call an election. So minorities can, particularly this type of minority in which you need all three parties to get together in order to defeat them, unless the Liberals decide to go back to the people for some reason, and they'll have to have a really good reason, it's tough to see how they all get together in order to do this. I think the really interesting question that's going to, so we're going through this period right now in which there's, I think, a fair amount of attention that's going to go to Aaron O'Toole. As we start getting into the Christmas holidays, and we start getting into January, and Abigail and the rest of the parliamentary press gallery starts doing the retrospective on the year and the look aheads, that the question is now going to turn to what's Justin Trudeau's future. Because that's going to be the big question. Is he going to take a walk in the snow like his father did on a February day? It's just too compelling a narrative not to at least ask those questions and talk about those things. And columnists, it's the easiest column to write. So I think you're going to see an awful lot of coverage on the future of Justin Trudeau. And I think whether less, in the immediate term, less the question of whether or not this government is going to be defeated and we're going to go back to the polls, is what's Justin Trudeau going to do and what's going to happen with the Liberal leadership. I think that there's going to be a fair amount of pressure, not from his party, but from the Canadian population to be looking for some sort of a change. As I said, his leadership's now been through the full cycle. Darling to disappointment to dislike. I mean, so there's no majority there for him. He did not come out of this election campaign strengthened. His reputation, if anything, got worse. Tofino shows, he still hasn't learned. So I think that that's really where the question should be. It's not whether the government lasts, it's whether Justin Trudeau decides to take a walk in the snow.
I have to agree with the growing consensus. I have to actually agree a lot with Darrell. It all depends on Trudeau, but I think it also depends on whoever replaces him. And Chrystia Freeland is certainly a contender to replace him. She's always present at any of his high-profile events. Basically, she's being we're being conditioned to seeing her as prime ministerial. So I think there's already been a walk in the snow or a walk on the beach or whatever you want to call to consider an exit from politics, because yeah, the history will show that not too many political leaders return from being disliked. I can think of one that has, and that's Robert Bourassa. He was extremely disliked as Premier of Quebec, and when he lost the election in 1976, not only was he disliked, he had to leave. He had, like a deposed dictator, he fled. He went to the UK in exile, only to return a few years later as a hero. I'm not too sure if that's in the cards for Trudeau, but certainly it does seem that he exhausted his political capital. And now I don't know if he's going to call an election. We'll see who the next leader the Liberals will do and whether they feel the mood is ripe for another election, potentially one better for them. But I really don't see a majority happening for Trudeau. So him calling an election, I think will risk the Liberals losing entirely. So we'll see what happens when that situation resolves itself.
From the walk in the snow to the walk on the beach. That's very good, Abigail. I'm sure Andrea won't mind if that finds its way to a global news headline. That's very good. I like that.
Excellent. Yeah.
We're getting to the end here. I'll just try to close up with a couple of questions. James Howard asks, did the Conservatives win more Liberal seats than they lost because of the PPC? To Darrell.
No, I think they lost. They lost a lot of Liberal seats. They had to win in the 905, and they got close, but they didn't get close enough. Do I think that the People's Party in a few seats made a difference? Yeah, they probably did. But I think by far the biggest problem was that they could not punch through with a compelling economic message that would unite the West in suburban Canada. And Stephen Harper's figured out how to do this, and the Conservatives have yet to mount a leader who can move beyond understanding it. They understand it, but they don't, at this point, haven't figured out a way to make it actually happen.
Okay, I think that kind of finishes it. And so I think, unless there's any other questions, I think I'll say that we can mark that as the end of the Barry K lecture this year. Thank you very much for everybody for joining us. Thanks, Darrell. Thanks, Abigail. Thanks, Andrea. I really learned a lot. And thanks to all our attendees for taking the time to join us. And I hope we don't have to see each other in 18 months for the 2023 election review panel. As much as I enjoy them, yeah, we could use a break. So I'll say goodbye and express my thanks again, and take care.